The earth does not forget the footsteps of the dead. Beneath the moss-laden soil of Romanian villages, something ancient stirs, not in body, but in memory. A breeze moves through the forest like breath through teeth. Somewhere in the dark, a bell tolls not for the living, but for those who should not have returned. There are stories that whisper more than they speak, stories that refuse to stay buried. Among the Carpathian valleys and whispering pines, such a story survives, old as grief, sharp as hunger. Before the name Dracula ever passed through a novelist's pen, there were other names. Names spoken only at night, names that scratched the doors of peasants' homes long after the graves had settled. They called them Strigoi. The Strigoi were not the beautiful monsters of modern fantasy. No silk capes, no immortal seductions. They were swollen, bloated with the rot of death. Their skin pale or bruised, their nails long, their eyes hollow with remembrance. They smelled of the grave, and they came back not to love, but to consume. This was not fiction, it was ritual. And in the villages of Romania, it was taken as seriously as winter or famine. It began with a feeling, a sickness that had no source. A cow would stop giving milk. A child would cry at night without reason. Bread would rot too fast. Then, a name would surface. The name of someone recently buried. Someone who died too quickly, too strangely. Someone whose shadow never quite left the room. And so the villagers would gather beneath the gray sky, gripping crosses and iron tools. They would dig into earth that protested with every shovelful. They would lift the lid, and if the corpse inside looked too fresh, too red in the lips, too intact, the truth was clear. The dead had returned. Hearts were stabbed. Heads were severed. Sometimes the body was turned face down, so it could not find its way back. At times the heart was burned, and the ashes stirred into wine, a bitter sacrament meant to protect the living. The line between superstition and survival was never drawn in ink. It was scratched into the soil by trembling hands, passed down through generations like a warning in the wind. But what terrified most was not the violence of the Strigoi. It was the familiarity. The idea that it was not a stranger who haunted you. It was a sister, a father, a beloved child. The Strigoi did not crawl from distant legends. They rose from your own family tree, distorted by death, and drawn back by unfinished love or unspoken rage. And unlike the vampire of Western fiction, the Strigoi was not immortal. It was vulnerable, physical, something that could be stopped, but only if named, only if believed in. This belief was not confined to some forgotten corner of Europe. It spread quietly, like mold in a root cellar. It whispered into the ears of chroniclers, priests, and eventually writers. And somewhere along this crooked path, the myth began to change, to evolve, to seduce. Long before Dracula wore a crown of pages, the Strigoi fed on real fear, and something older still, guilt. Because what if the dead rise not out of malice, but because we could not let go? Because grief is a kind of hunger, and memory a mouth that never stops feeding. In the stillness of night, grief moves like fog, slow, creeping, unavoidable. It gathers at the thresholds of memory, pressing against the doors of reason. And when reason fails, ritual takes its place. For those who feared the Strigoi, belief was not weakness, it was protection. The act of believing gave form to the invisible. It made sense of the senseless. A sudden death became a sign. A cold wind became a whisper. The grave became a gate. And once opened, it could not be easily closed. villagers learned to read omens like scripture. A howling dog outside a window. Milk curdling under a full moon. Dreams in which the dead spoke in languages no longer known. All were warnings. Warnings that someone had crossed back into the world of the living. There were stories of Strigoi, who returned not as beasts, but as mourners. They sat at the edge of the bed, silent, their eyes filled with sorrow, not rage. They watched their loved ones sleep or weep or pray, but the longer they stayed, the colder the house became. Fires refused to catch. Mirrors clouded over. Shadows clung too long to the walls. Love unprocessed turned sour. Grief fermented. To modern ears, these stories may sound like madness. But in these remote places, truth was not what could be measured. It was what could be felt. If fear lived in the chest, if breath turned shallow, if something unseen pressed its weight against your soul, that was truth enough. And so, the rituals deepened. Children were taught to place iron scissors beneath pillows. Graves were salted, bodies bound. Coins were placed under tongues not just for passage to the afterlife, but to keep the mouth shut, to keep the dead from speaking their way back. One of the most feared signs of a Strigoi was not the sighting, but the silence. When a village became too quiet, when birds ceased singing, when even the dogs refused to bark. That was when elders would rise from their beds, wrap themselves in wool and prayer, and begin to dig. These exhumations were not acts of cruelty, but of desperation. The villagers did not see themselves as executioners. They were guardians, defenders of the threshold between life and death. They were not trying to punish the dead. They were trying to release them. Sometimes a corpse would be found, with blood at the lips, as if it had fed. Sometimes the eyes were open. Sometimes the body was turned, curled, as if in agony. And though science has offered explanations, decomposition, gas, pressure, to those who watched with shaking hands, the message was clear. The dead had not stayed dead. It was not uncommon for entire villages to join in the rite. A fire lit in the center of the square, the heart extracted, dried, and burned to ash. The smoke rising like a plea to the heavens. Children were made to sip the bitter wine brewed from the ashes, a ritual of defense and perhaps of communion. For centuries, these rites remained tucked into the folds of peasant life, ignored by the cities, disdained by the churches. But the fear never vanished. It mutated, it migrated, and eventually it found new language, new symbols, new stories. Because when the Strigoi crossed borders, they did not shed their skins. They put on masks. The mask of the vampire was born not in forests, but in fear. And it did not rise from crypts alone. It was summoned, shaped, refined by ink. By those who gazed eastward, toward a land both foreign and trembling with superstition. They saw the Strigoi not for what it was, a raw cultural wound, but for what it could become: entertainment. Western Europe had long flirted with ghosts and revenants, but the figure of the blood drinker, elegant and damned, seductive and soulless, was still embryonic. It was the Strigoi, primitive, grotesque, ancestral, that offered the missing flesh. And the pen, hungry like a fang, began to bite. Writers traveled, or imagined they had. They took whispers from the Romanian hills and bent them to the shape of a gothic dream. No longer the bloated corpse exhumed in panic. Now the vampire was suave, calculated, immortal not just in body, but in charisma. The Strigoi's rage was rewritten as charm, its grotesquerie softened into style. And thus, the transformation began. In the 18th and 19th centuries, tales of vampirism crept through Europe like a shadow spilling across a page. The vampire was no longer just a corpse returned. It became an archetype, a metaphor, a cipher for forbidden desires, repressed anxieties, and the unspoken lusts of an age trembling under corsets and crucifixes. But even as the myth evolved, its roots remained tangled in Romanian soil. The name was changed, but the shape was familiar. The fear of the returning dead, the dread of loved ones becoming other. These primal elements persisted, wearing new costumes for new audiences. And then came the name that would silence all others, Dracula. Born from the imagination of Bram Stoker, but midwifed by centuries of folklore, Dracula became the crown upon the head of a lineage soaked in ash and bone. He was not the Strigoi, but without the Strigoi, he could never have existed. Stoker, whether knowingly or by instinct, fed upon the old fears like a literary parasite. He found tales of Vlad the Impaler, a historical prince with a taste for violence, and married them to whispers of blood-drinking dead. The result was not history. It was mythology reborn, forged in the furnace of Victorian repression and colonial fascination. The mask was complete, but behind that mask, something still breathed. The original myth had not vanished. It had been buried, just as the Strigoi were, buried beneath layers of fiction, fantasy, and forgetfulness, buried beneath velvet cloaks and candlelit castles. But like the revenants it described, the truth refused to stay dead. And so the question rises once again: why do these stories endure? Is it merely fear, or is it recognition? Do we see in the vampire not just the monstrous, but the mirrored? Do we sense, deep in the marrow of the myth, something that belongs to us? A grief too ancient to name, a hunger passed down through generations like a shadow on the soul. Because the Strigoi was never just about death, it was about return, about the things we bury that do not stay buried, about the past that creeps back into the present, uninvited and unrepentant. It is the story of memory that devours, of love turned rancid, of sorrow left to rot. And if the vampire is a mask, then what does it hide? It hides the unbearable, the unresolved. It hides the truth that we do not grieve well, that some sorrows are too wild for funerals, too restless for tombs. The vampire myth is not merely a fear of death, it is a failure of death, a wound that never seals. In the old villages, long before the vampire wore tuxedos and seduced across ballroom floors, the Strigoi embodied a simpler terror, that death could be incomplete, that burial was not the end, that something could go wrong, and not just in flesh, but in spirit. Sometimes it began with a nightmare, a child waking, breathless, convinced their dead grandfather stood over the bed, or a woman, 3 months widowed, claiming to hear her husband's steps on the roof. These stories were not dismissed, they were feared, because everyone knew the Strigoi could return if the rites were not done properly. And sometimes, even when the rituals were exact, they came back anyway. Priests were called, graves reopened, corpses examined for signs, too much blood at the lips, too little decay. But beyond the rituals, beyond the tools and prayers, there was always something deeper beneath the fear, something few dared name: doubt. What if the dead were not angry, but lonely? What if the Strigoi were not monsters, but echoes? A kind of echo that grows louder the more we try to silence it. It is here that the myth begins to shift. Because to see the Strigoi not as demon, but as reflection, that is the first turn of the blade. And the deeper we look, the more we begin to understand. The true terror is not what returns, but why it returns. Consider this. A man dies young suddenly. His widow grieves too deeply, speaks to him at night, dreams of him constantly. Her neighbors notice her withering, her livestock fail, her eyes sink. The village whispers, "He has returned." But perhaps what has returned is not the man himself, but the refusal to let him go. Her sorrow becomes a shape, her memory, a haunting. And in the language of the time, lacking psychology, lacking therapy, the myth rises to contain the emotion. The Strigoi becomes the vessel. And so we find ourselves at a crossroads. One path tells of corpses and curses, blood-drinking revenants clawing their way from the earth. The other tells of sorrow too powerful to remain silent, of grief that slips between worlds, wearing the skin of folklore to be seen. In both stories, the village must act. It must purge the fear, burn the heart, break the connection. But what is destroyed in the process? What is silenced, not just in the grave, but in the hearts of the living? In that silence lies the secret. Because when myths endure for centuries, they do so not because they are false, but because they speak to something true, something we are not ready to face directly. And so we call it a monster. We bury it. And when it rises, we do not ask why, we only ask how to stop it. But to stop the Strigoi is to stop the return of the repressed, the cry of the ungrieved, the song of the unfinished. And what if, all this time, the Strigoi was never warning us of death, but of something worse? Perhaps the Strigoi warns of forgetting, of lives unlived, of truths unspoken and buried beneath polite silence. It is not the grave that terrifies us. It is the idea that we might be erased before ever being seen. In this way, the Strigoi is not merely a corpse that walks. It is a life that lingers, a hunger, not just for blood, but for acknowledgement. The myth lingers because it names what cannot otherwise be named, the unbearable weight of the unprocessed. And what society cannot process, it must transform into legend, into warning, into shadow. Here the Strigoi takes its second form, not as a monster of the forest or the crypt, but as a social cipher, a boundary marker, an encoded ritual of exclusion. It was not only the strange or the suspicious who were named Strigoi. Often it was the outsider, the one who lived alone, the child born under an eclipse, the widow who refused to remarry, the man who questioned the priest. These people carried the seed of something unspeakable, a deviation, a difference. And when they died, that difference didn't vanish. It festered. And so the village watched and waited for signs, for rot, for return. In naming someone a Strigoi, the community did something chilling. It retroactively confirmed its suspicions. It rewrote the life of the accused through the lens of fear. Every kindness became a manipulation. Every silence, a threat. Every illness that followed, their fault. And so, exhumation became not just a rite of purification, but of justice, of control. The heart was not just burned to stop the revenant. It was burned to erase what made them other. The Strigoi, in this form, is the scapegoat. And what is a scapegoat, if not a vessel for collective fear? We see this pattern repeated across centuries and continents. Witch hunts, demon possessions, public executions. Whenever the collective psyche becomes too burdened, it seeks release, not through reflection, but projection, not through healing, but fire. But the fire never cleanses, it only hides the wound for a while. And so the Strigoi rises again. Even today, in some villages, quiet rituals persist. Nails driven into coffins, mirrors turned to the wall when someone dies, old customs that no one questions, because questioning invites memory, and memory, if awakened, might bring something back. This is the paradox of the Strigoi. We fear it, yet we preserve it. We whisper its name, feed it through story, paint it with fiction, but never truly confront what lies beneath. Because what if the Strigoi is not the one who failed to rest, but the one we failed to mourn? What if they return not to torment the living, but to remind us of all we have chosen to forget? What we exiled, what we labeled monstrous, what we drove into the ground, not because it was evil, but because it was inconvenient. In the Strigoi's gaze, we do not see fangs. We see regret. And regret, like any ghost, grows stronger when ignored. Regret has no grave. It lives in gestures unfinished, in apologies never spoken, in the empty chair left untouched for years. It does not wail like the banshee or rattle chains in the attic. Instead, it stains, quietly, the walls of memory. And it is this quiet haunting that gives the Strigoi its truest form. For beneath the blood and the legend, beneath the folklore and flame, the myth persists because it answers something deeper than fear. It answers guilt. Not divine guilt, not sin in the eyes of gods, but the guilt of the ordinary, the guilt of the living, the guilt of forgetting too soon, of moving on too quickly, of pretending that death is clean. In this way, the Strigoi is not a creature of the grave, but of the hearth. It rises not in distant forests, but in homes where grief was silenced, where the mourning period was rushed, where the dead were spoken of only in past tense when they still occupied the present soul. Psychologists might call this unresolved trauma, but villagers had no such terms. They had only stories, only signs, only fear, and through these, a strange wisdom that what is unspoken does not disappear. It returns, with teeth. That return may not always wear a body. Sometimes it wears behavior. A child begins to act like a dead relative. A mother withdraws, claiming to hear voices. A town spirals into paranoia after a funeral. These are the Strigoi of the mind, no less real, no less destructive. And here we reach the boundary between myth and psyche. Modern minds try to explain the Strigoi through science, decomposition, disease, psychological projection. But such analysis flattens the story, reduces it, because the myth was never trying to describe anatomy. It was describing experience. The experience of loss as rupture, the sense that something was torn and never repaired, that the world after death was slightly crooked, tilted, off. The villagers felt this crookedness in their bones. They answered it not with books, but with ritual, with fire, with ash. But what if the ash did not cleanse? What if the rituals were not endings but beginnings, not protections but invitations? To burn a heart is to make a symbol, and symbols have gravity. They shape the soul that performs them. They change the way a village dreams. So over time, the Strigoi ceased to be just a revenant. It became a presence, an atmosphere, a lens through which every cough, every misfortune, every shadow took on new weight. Even the language changed. People stopped speaking plainly. They used euphemisms, codes, To say someone might turn was enough. To hint that a grave was unsettled could stir panic. Words once casual became incantations. This is how myth evolves. Not with a roar, but with a whisper. Not through invention, but accumulation. Fear by fear. Loss by loss. And always beneath it that same quiet longing to understand what we are not ready to feel. Because in the end, the Strigoi is not just what returns, it is what refuses to be resolved. And if we dare to look closer, we may find that the true haunting was never in the ground, but in the mirror. Because the mirror remembers what we try to forget. It does not reflect only the face, it reflects the weight behind the eyes. And in that reflection, we sometimes see not ourselves, but those we've lost. Or worse, the parts of ourselves we buried to survive. The Strigoi myth persists not because it entertains, but because it reveals. It reveals the fractures in our lineage, the silences passed from mother to daughter, the secrets swallowed by fathers who never wept. These revenants are not merely folklore, they are emotional inheritance. To speak of the Strigoi, then, is to speak of ancestry, of what we carry unknowingly, of the wounds that echo across generations, not as stories, but as symptoms. A family haunted not by ghosts, but by patterns. In many rural homes, it was believed that certain lineages were more susceptible, that some families bore the mark, not in blood, but in memory. The memory of shame or betrayal or sorrow too large for a single lifetime. And so it leaked into dreams, into behaviors, into legends. This belief wasn't born of superstition. It was a kind of ancestral psychology, spoken in the language of myth. In these stories, the Strigoi was not always punished. Sometimes it was pitied, a soul caught between worlds, a being not of evil, but of imbalance. And here we begin to glimpse a forgotten truth, that the boundary between monster and mourner is often paper-thin. Because to become a Strigoi, one did not need to be cursed, only broken. Perhaps the soul tore at the moment of death, or perhaps long before. A betrayal, a shameful act, a secret never confessed. These were wounds that denied rest. And so the dead wandered, not to feed, but to finish. The villagers in their own way understood this. They performed rituals not only to protect the living, but to heal the dead, to close the door, to release what was trapped. There is compassion, buried deep in the fear. But in modernity, we have forgotten this nuance. We remember the teeth, not the grief. The fire, not the silence that came before it. Now the vampire is sleek, cinematic, detached from its roots. But the Strigoi, the true Strigoi, still walks quietly beneath that mask. It watches from the corners of the room. It whispers through hereditary dreams. And perhaps it has never stopped asking the question, what becomes of a soul that dies before it is heard? This is not just a folkloric inquiry, it is a psychological one. In the world of the unconscious, nothing truly dies. Repressed memory returns. Unspoken fears manifest. The past, like the Strigoi, claws its way into the present, demanding attention. And perhaps this is the final transformation of the myth, from superstition to symbol, from rural terror to archetype. The Strigoi becomes a mirror for the shadow self, the unacknowledged, the unwanted, the grief that never grew old, the hunger that never found language. And to confront the Strigoi, then, is to confront the lineage within. Not just the stories we were told, but the silences we inherited. And if we listen closely, perhaps we can still hear them, not howling in the night, but weeping in the walls, because not all hauntings are loud. Some arrive as silence that settles too deeply, as cold that lingers in a warm room, as a sudden memory that doesn't feel like your own. These are the Strigoi in their most subtle form, not walking through graveyards, but living in our breath. And here the myth shifts once again. For what if the Strigoi is not just a revenant or a wound, but a signal, a coded message, encrypted in centuries of fear, calling us to reckon not only with death, but with truth. By the late 19th century, as folklore was collected, dissected, and repackaged for European salons, the myth was no longer simply feared, it was exoticized. Romanian peasants were depicted as backward, superstitious, unscientific. The rituals were mocked. The fears were flattened. But folklore is never just folklore. It is a memory system, a cultural immune response. And the Strigoi, in this new context, revealed not only psychological insight, but political meaning. Because just as the Strigoi symbolized the excluded, so too did the Romanian people feel excluded from the modern gaze, seen as peripheral, mystical, even primitive. And so the myth, like the people, was misunderstood, decontextualized, turned into spectacle. This is the second death of the Strigoi. Not the grave, but the stage. But myths do not die. They transform. And in this moment, the Strigoi did something remarkable. It slipped through the fingers of anthropologists and authors and re-entered the bloodstream of culture through a different vein, literature. And in literature, it became Dracula. Dracula is not a villain, he is a vessel, a Western attempt to contain something Eastern, to turn a messy, emotional, ancestral story into a clean narrative of predator and prey. But beneath his elegance, his aristocratic charm, the old fear still thrums, because Dracula carries within him the bones of the Strigoi. He crosses oceans, yes, but he also crosses thresholds. He is neither alive nor dead, neither holy monster nor man. He is liminal, transitional, a border being. And borders are always dangerous because they remind us that categories are fragile, that nothing stays buried, that history too can rise from the ground, hungry. And if Dracula became global, it is because the myth beneath him, the Strigoi, speaks to something universal. The fear that the past is not finished, that our ancestors are not at peace, that our shadows are not fully owned. So the vampire became an icon, but the Strigoi remained a mirror, one distorted by centuries of retelling, one fogged by misunderstanding, but still intact, still waiting for us to stop looking away. Because perhaps the Strigoi is not chasing us, perhaps it's leading us back to something we've lost, a way of mourning that was communal, a way of storytelling that was sacred, a way of feeling grief not as weakness, but as responsibility. And if that is true, then maybe we must ask a final forbidden question. What if the Strigoi is not the problem, but the cure? A cure disguised in terror, a ritual in the shape of horror. What if the Strigoi came not to take life, but to restore balance, to bring attention to what had been ignored, silenced, suppressed? In ancient systems of belief, healing did not always look gentle. The medicine could sting, the ritual could demand blood. Shamans understood this, that to expel a sickness, one must often meet it face to face. Not banish it, but invite it in. Let it speak. And perhaps the Strigoi is that voice, the ancestral scream wrapped in myth, demanding to be heard. If so, then the villagers who exhumed the dead were not simply defending themselves. They were participating in an act older than fear, the negotiation between the living and the dead. A conversation, though painful, meant to restore what had been broken. Because the Strigoi only appears when balance is lost. Not everyone becomes one. Not every soul returns. Only those who died wrong, those whose stories were unfinished, those whose deaths were unanswered by grief. There is, in this mythology, a radical idea that death is not a line, but a process, and that the living play a role in completing it. Modern culture tends to run from death, to sanitize it, hide it behind hospital curtains and sterile graves. But the old world did not hide. It watched, it listened, it understood that the dead, if ignored, could turn volatile, not out of malice, but out of need. Need to be remembered, need to be reconciled. And so the myth was born, not just to explain death, but to repair it. Seen this way, the rituals of burning hearts, of drinking ash, of turning bodies in the grave, they take on a different light. Not barbaric acts, but desperate medicine. Not superstition, but ceremony. The Strigoi then becomes not a monster to fear, but a teacher. It teaches that grief cannot be skipped, that sorrow unexpressed becomes contagious, that what we bury in haste will rise again, more powerful, more misunderstood, more hungry. And here lies the second twist of the myth, that the Strigoi is not an interruption of death's order, but a continuation of it. A demand that we finish what we started, that we mourn properly, that we remember fully. Even today, echoes of this logic remain. In Romania, some still turn mirrors during funerals, so the dead won't be trapped inside. Some still keep a coin by the window, so the soul can find its way. These are not signs of fear, they are signs of participation. A willingness to stay in relationship with what has passed. Because to forget the dead is to deny part of ourselves. And this is what the Strigoi truly avenges: disconnection. From lineage, from memory, from ritual, from the sacred grief that binds the generations. So perhaps it is not the vampire that survives us, but the lesson inside it. And the lesson is this: nothing, not even death, ends without acknowledgement. And so the Strigoi comes not as punishment, but as reminder. Not to drag the living into death, but to pull death back into the circle of life. To insist that the boundary is not a wall, but a veil. And that the veil must be lifted from time to time, so that we remember who we are. In this sense, the Strigoi is the ritual we forgot how to perform. It appears when something vital has been severed, the thread between generations, the sacred grief song, the story that gave meaning to loss. It arrives when we have lost the art of mourning and replaced it with efficiency. When we hide our dead not in earth, but in denial. What rises from that denial is not peace, it is unrest. And the form that unrest takes, in dream, in illness, in myth, is the Strigoi. In Romanian villages, the signs were subtle. A child falling sick after a funeral, animals refusing to eat, a well souring without cause. These were not coincidences. They were symptoms, warnings. The dead were not gone. They were waiting to be named. Because naming is an ancient magic. It binds the world into meaning. It tells the soul, you are seen, you are remembered, you existed. The Strigoi was, at its heart, a protest against forgetting, against the anonymity of the grave, against the idea that death should be silent, invisible, polite. But the modern world does not know how to listen. It rushes forward hungry for newness, blind to what follows behind. It treats mourning as weakness, memory as burden, And so the Strigoi grows stronger, not in folklore, but in the body. Anxiety, insomnia, the shadow of grief with no name. These are the new hauntings. They do not scratch at windows. They sit inside the chest. They steal the breath. And in them, the ancient myth continues, hidden in plain sight. Because even if we no longer believe in revenants, we still feel their echo. Every unresolved loss is a ghost. Every silence where a story should have been is a haunting. And every time we fail to witness the pain of those before us, the myth reactivates. It is not punishment. It is a call to remember the deeper function of death, to connect us, not separate us, to weave the generations, not sever them. The Strigoi reminds us that what dies in the body must still be carried in the soul, not as burden, but as legacy. And perhaps this is the true face of the myth, not a creature with fangs, but a face we recognize, a face like our own. Because the Strigoi, in the end, is not just the unburied, it is the unfinished. And if we listen to its footsteps, faint as they may be, we might still recover the path it wants us to walk, toward memory, toward ritual, toward healing. But healing is never quiet. It stirs the ground. It shakes the roots. It pulls the bones of old pain to the surface like artifacts long buried. And when the villagers whispered of Strigoi, they were also whispering of these bones, of traumas too old to name but too present to ignore. In this way, the Strigoi is not just personal. It is ancestral. It carries the pain of generations, passed down like heirlooms in the blood, not through genetics, but through gesture, through silence, through the ritual of what was left unsaid. And in these haunted silences, the myth grows teeth. Because how many families carry a story they don't tell? How many children grow up feeling the weight of grief they never witnessed? The Strigoi is the unspoken law of emotional inheritance, the reminder that what is not metabolized becomes mythologized. In Romania, long before Dracula, the Strigoi was already ancient, not invented, but evolved. The word itself stretches back to the Latin striga, and even further into the shadowy lexicons of pagan Europe. But its origin is not in language. It is in need. The need for explanation. The need for a shape to hold sorrow. The need for justice when life offers none. In this light, the rituals once deemed grotesque begin to take on new dimension. Digging up the dead was not cruelty. It was a cry for coherence. Burning the heart was not revenge. It was the desperate wish that pain might finally end. Because in villages where the world was small and death was near, people could not afford abstraction. They needed stories that could hold blood, that could explain why a child died in her sleep, or why milk soured, or why a mother's eyes went empty after a funeral. They needed to believe that something could be done, that the past, however terrible, was not untouchable. So they touched it. They touched the grave. They touched the memory. They touched the pain. And the Strigoi became not just the symbol of what went wrong, but the key to making it right. Of course, not every tale was gentle. Some were filled with violence, with fear, with collective cruelty. But even these are part of the pattern, the shadow side of the ritual. Because sometimes when a culture is denied tools for healing, it turns its wounds outward. The Strigoi was both the wound and the attempt to close it. And perhaps that's why it has lasted. Not because it is terrifying, but because it is true. True in the way that dreams are true. That poetry is true. That grief, unnamed, will always find a voice, even if that voice comes, with claws. And maybe we're ready now to listen, not with superstition, but with reverence, not to mock the old fears, but to understand what they were protecting. Because if the Strigoi speaks through symbols, then the symbol is not the end. It is the door. And the door, once opened, reveals not terror, but tenderness. Not a monster in the dark, but a presence that has waited too long to be seen. The Strigoi does not burst through, it lingers, patient, wounded, unfinished. It asks not for blood, but for witness. This is the secret that centuries of fear have buried, that the undead are not always hungry. Sometimes they are lonely. Sometimes they return because they were never fully loved. What is love, after all, if not the act of seeing someone completely? Even in their silence, even in their absence? The old myths understood this. They wrapped it in symbols so that it would survive. Because a truth this raw could not be spoken outright. Not in a world where death had to be strong, final, clean. So the Strigoi came back, again and again, in stories told by candlelight, in lullabies half-sung, in the tremble of hands that washed a body for burial. And in each story, there was a lesson, not just about death, but about presence, about what it means to stay with the pain, to stay with the memory, to stay with the ones who left before they could say goodbye. The villagers knew this instinctively. Their rituals were crude by modern standards, but they were never meaningless. To open a grave was to admit that something had been left undone. To confront the Strigoi was to confront the limits of their own grieving. They did not know the language of trauma, but they knew the weight of it, and they passed it down in myths, in warnings, in songs. A mother might say, "Don't go out after sunset. The Strigoi walks." But beneath the warning was a deeper message. Be careful what you leave unresolved. It may find you again. Even now, in quiet corners of rural Romania, remnants of this wisdom survive. A candle lit for 9 nights after a death. Bread left on windowsills. Coins placed in the mouth of the dead, not to pay the ferryman, but to ensure they could speak if they returned. Because return is always a possibility in this worldview. Nothing is ever truly over. Every action echoes. Every silence resonates. The Strigoi is not a glitch in the order. It is the order reminding us of what we forgot. And if it is a door, then the choice remains ours, to slam it shut or to walk through. To listen finally not just to the myth, but to the ache beneath it. Because beneath every ghost story is a love story. And beneath every love story is a grief that refuses to fade. Because grief is love with no place to go. And the Strigoi, in its quiet defiance, gives that love a body, however broken, however feared. It returns not to destroy what was left behind, but to remind us it was never truly left. In the mythology of the Strigoi, it is easy to see only the horror, the claw, the eye, the scream in the night. But beneath that mask, always, is longing, a longing to be held again, to be remembered not just as a name on a stone, but as breath, as laughter, as flaw and feeling. This is the ache that gives rise to ritual, not fear of the dead, but refusal to let them vanish. And perhaps this is what has always terrified us most, not the revenant itself, but the possibility that we failed it, that the dead returned because we did not love them well enough, that our grief was too shallow, our mourning too brief, our words too few. But this is not a myth of blame. It is a myth of second chances. The Strigoi returns not as judgment, but as mirror. It shows us our unfinished songs, our unopened letters, our unsaid prayers. It asks nothing but this: to be faced, to be named, to be honored. And if we do that, if we meet it not with torch and stake, but with recognition, something begins to shift. The story bends. The monster softens. Because no creature can remain monstrous in the presence of empathy. That is the hidden alchemy of this myth. Transformation through witnessing. It is no coincidence that the vampire in modern fiction is immortal, but the Strigoi is not. It does not live forever. It lingers only until it is seen. Its curse is not eternity, it is neglect. And its release is simple: remembrance, to speak the name, to tell the story, to weep, not in shame, but in reverence. The villagers once feared the Strigoi, yes, but they also knew how to release it. With song, with symbol, with ritual acts passed down like recipes for sorrow. And maybe we've forgotten the specifics, the herbs, the words, the gestures, but the need remains. The ache to complete what was broken. The impulse to light a candle not just for comfort, but for connection. We may live in cities now behind locked doors and electric lights, but the Strigoi still finds its way in. Through memory, through dream, through the quiet, sacred act of missing someone who never fully left. And in that space, dark, tender, unguarded, the myth comes home. Not as threat, but as truth. And if it is truth, then we must ask, whose truth? The fear of the villagers, or the ache of the revenant? The myth that protects us, or the one that exposes us? Somewhere in the tangled threads of this story, the final paradox waits: that the Strigoi was never chasing us. We were chasing it, not with torches or salt, but with a hunger we didn't understand. A hunger to recover something lost, a language, a ritual, a belonging deeper than blood. And what if the Strigoi, in all its terror, is the vessel of that belonging? What if the monster is our memory? Twisted, yes. Frightening, yes. But still trying, in its broken spectral way, to carry what we refuse to hold. This is the moment where the story turns, because all along we thought the Strigoi was trying to take from us life, light, lineage. But what if it was trying to give something back? What if every haunting was a hand reaching through centuries, offering a piece of the past we lost? The monster becomes the messenger. It comes not to punish, but to preserve. The songs that were never written down, the names no one speaks anymore, the tears that never reached the floor, all wrapped in myth, passed mouth to mouth, until even fear became a form of remembering. The villagers may have called it cursed, but they listened. They watched. They performed. And in their rituals, primitive though they seemed, they preserved a truth that modernity forgot. That grief is sacred. That silence is dangerous. That memory, if not tended, will return in wilder, stranger shapes. So the Strigoi becomes the guardian of those shapes. It stands at the edge of forgetting and refuses to move. And maybe that's why it terrified us. Not because it was evil, but because it was right. Because it reminded us that the past never dies, that the dead still speak, that the sacred is not clean or comfortable. It is raw, it is unresolved, it is awake. This is the final twist. Not in the story, but in us. We came here looking for monsters. We found a mirror. And in that mirror, something ancient stares back. Not a vampire, not a ghost, but a presence that has watched us bury our truths for generations and waited. Waited not to strike, but to be received, to be welcomed, to be understood. Waited not with rage, but with resolve, not with malice, but with memory. The Strigoi, after all the blood, the ritual, the whispers, stands not as death incarnate, but as the echo of what we dared not feel. And now finally, it is felt. In this final light, the myth reveals itself. It was never about the undead. It was about the unlived, the unfinished, the unloved. The Strigoi comes from the spaces we leave behind, in grief, in history, in heart. And through that emptiness, it walks, not to destroy, but to remind. Remind us that we are stewards of the past, that forgetting is not freedom, it is fracture, that what we refuse to acknowledge does not disappear, it transforms into story, into fear, into myth. And so we gather at the grave not to keep the dead down, but to raise something up. Understanding, connection, healing. The villagers of old Romania knew this in their bones. The rituals they performed were messy, yes, but they were honest. They did not turn away. They looked death in the eye and said, "We see you, we name you, we walk with you." And now it is our turn, not to copy their customs, but to reclaim the spirit behind them, to make mourning sacred again, to treat memory not as archive, but as altar, to let the past breathe through us, not as ghost, but as guide. Because what haunts us is not the dead, it's the parts of ourselves we bury to survive. And perhaps the Strigoi, in all its forms, is the bridge back to those parts. A myth that wounds, yes, but also a myth that stitches. Because all true myths are tools, not just to explain the world, but to mend it. And in the Strigoi we find a tool so old it nearly rusted from misuse. But it still fits the hand. It still turns the lock. And behind that lock is something worth remembering, not Dracula, not the vampire of novels, but the older figure, the weeping shadow, the restless one who returned not for blood, but for voice. And in listening, truly listening, we give it peace. And we receive something in return. A new way of grieving, a deeper way of living, a myth remade, not in fear, but in reverence. A story not of darkness, but of return. Thank you for walking with me through the forgotten hills of Romanian folklore, and for listening to the true story of the Strigoi. These ancient tales are not merely shadows from the past. They are mirrors, still breathing, still speaking. My mission here at Forgotten Lore is to uncover those voices, to give memory its rightful place, and to remind us all that myth is not fantasy. It is medicine. If this journey moved you, I invite you to stay with us. Subscribe to the channel, share the story, and let these echoes continue. The forest of forgotten lore is vast, and we've only just begun to explore its depths.